Brush pens are a wonderful tool, and one that I very much enjoy working with. For most of the time that I've spent as an artist, this was a medium I was completely unaware of, and is one of the big reasons why I encourage people frequently to try out new things when it comes to your art. What you're watching play out in the background here is at 2 times speed, and is just a random drawing I did in a brand new sketchbook getting started. And as I do this, I want to go over some tips for working with brush pen. If you've never tried, I would encourage you to do so. And there are lots of other markers and pens that will do the same things that these do. These here are King Art dual tip brush pens. I love them. They're not particularly expensive, but with that, let's go ahead and dive in. The first thing that I think is really important when working with brush pens is to work freely at the beginning. You'll notice right here at the beginning of this drawing, I was working with very loose and broad marks. I wasn't particularly worried about something turning out correct or not. I was just trying to find the shapes that would give me this interesting kind of awkward monster. After I had that baseline, I began to go in with my pens. And to be transparent, I almost always use brush pens in conjunction with actual pens. I generally use my microns, but fine liners will do of any kind. In fact, even if you just had a ballpoint pen and you made sure that you let it dry entirely before working back over it, it would work. But this is the next stage that I like to jump in, because this gives me the ability to work out some of those loose shapes from earlier, find what I liked, what I didn't. You'll notice as I go about making these marks, some of them are very close to the original and some are wildly divergent. This guy's a little bit more chunky in my sketch than the final version comes out to, and I'm happy to say that I wouldn't know that if I hadn't worked so loosely in my first stages. Another thing to reiterate here is that working in with light tones at the beginning is really beneficial. I started with this very light green, almost transparent as you look at it here. It's a little bit better in reality. The lights have a hard time with that contrast. But working with really light tones allows you to build things up slowly. If you started with a really dark green, for example, it's going to be very difficult to go back over that and to modify it in any meaningful way. But starting with light allows you to build things slowly. If you start to make a mistake or something starts to go in a direction you don't like, you are able to fix it earlier, and you can always go over things with darker tones. So I would very much encourage you on any brush pen drawing you make, start with your light tones first. If you want to start with dark tones first, I would recommend gouache or acrylic, or even acrylic brush pens, things that will allow you to layer regardless of what is underneath. Returning to the pens and the fine liners, any kind of pen will do. It doesn't have to be a fine liner. I just rather enjoy them. The ones that I usually use, and the one that I'm using here, is actually a brush tip micron, like Pigma Micron. But a lot of times I just use a 0.25 millimeter tiny little pen. But I've used everything. Whatever pen you have lying around in a drawer around the house, or in your backpack, or they give away for free at banks and places like that, ballpoint pens, any of those will work. If you have anything, it will work on top of these as long as the layers are dry. But the pen does some really fun things. I have found it as an integral component in all of my brush pen drawings. It's never a bad idea at the beginning, once you begin to start moving into hatching or adding additional colors, to take the areas that you know are black and add in that level of contrast. What you're doing for yourself here is you're allowing the highlights, because so much of this is still white, to give you the full range of value. If you darken in your shadows, so they're black and your highlights are still there as white, you have 100% of the value spectrum. This makes it easier for your eyes to see things accurately when it comes to color and tone. At this stage, I like to begin getting in some basic hatching. This is not necessary for this kind of drawing, but if you've seen any of my work, you know I love working with hatching and cross-hatching. I do minimal here, and it's just to imply where shading is. In some aspects, it just lets me know later on when I come back in to do some finishing details where I need to put darker versions of those colors. I would recommend this though, because it adds a texture to your final piece. In fact, that's the whole point behind using the two different mediums here. It gives you a more full finished result. So if you haven't had a chance to practice much hatching in the past, this is a good place to start practicing it. That stage complete, I'll come in and I'll fill in, starting with light again, most of the color. This is a slow step. This is the time where it's good to have a podcast or something that you're watching in the background. It takes a while, but you don't have to be super clean about it. In fact, any areas where you suspect that you're going to put darker tones, you can work up to about where you think that edge is going to be, and then come back in later. This part of the drawing is generally where things will look a little weird though, and it's good to work it past that kind of teenage stage. Things are a little bit awkward, just like they are for so many of us as teenagers. And if you push through, you'll get to a stage that's a little bit more refined and is a little bit more true to itself. Here we start with the first layering of colors, and it will become apparent very quickly how beneficial this is. This is only a slightly darker green than the one that I was already using, and look at what happens. Everything starts to come into sharp focus. It becomes really easy to see everything that's happening in this drawing. And every subsequent layer you add as you go darker and darker, you will get more texture, more reality. And if you are doing what I'm doing here, which is really focusing on the three-dimensionality of things, trying to make your darker tones where there would be shadows, underneath the jaw, underneath the tongue, it's really going to give this illusion that it's more realistic, that it fits into three-dimensional space. This layering is also fun and methodical. It takes a lot of time to do, but I find that process enjoyable. It's, again, one of those things where it's a nice time to just put on something and listen to it. You're slowly working things in. The stressful stage of this kind of drawing is often early, and some of it's even avoided by doing the light sketching in. Probably the most stressful part is that area where you are working with the fine liners for the first time, but it's made less so by the fact that you have the help of the light sketch underneath it. Another tip here is to worry less about making sure everything is done in the correct order. You might watch me as I draw on this, as I fill things in, that I tend to bounce around from location to location. I kind of wish I could say that this was logical, that I was making, decisions specifically for every single one of those movements, but it's just not true. I am slowly accomplishing what I want to with the piece, but as things pop up in my peripheral vision, I will move over and I will handle that. Don't feel like you need to force yourself to work in one spot at a time, especially if there's something stressful in the drawing and you need to move to a different portion to kind of give yourself a break for a moment. It doesn't really matter what order you approach things. As long as you leave the areas that need to be highlighted out of your shading, you should be fine. Don't be afraid to add in additional colors as well. I could have just shaded the underside of this hat, for example, with some darker grays and then the brown over top of it, or I could have used just some hatching to make it look darker. But having a redder, warmer tone makes it a little bit more interesting. So don't be cautious when it comes to trying different colors. Again, there are ways to fix it if you make a mistake, but it's a drawing, and sometimes just experimenting can figure those things out. However, if you want a tip for knowing how a color is going to function before you risk putting it on your drawing, take a little part of another page. Work with the colors that you're working on all the time. In fact, it's never a bad idea to just make little swatches, little squares that will be like, this is this color, and you could even label them. This is helpful if you work on a drawing for a long period of time. But if you do that, you can actually take another color and put it next to that one or on top of it and see how it reacts. If you do this before you take it into your finished drawing, you can sometimes save yourself some pain from mistakes that you might make later. Well, that's pretty much all I have for this little guy. I'm going to go about coloring in his pants here at the end and then finally his shoes, but this pretty much covers everything that I wanted to get across in this video. So I hope this was beneficial to you. This is a little bit different format for what I generally do, so let me know which parts of it were helpful, and let me know which parts you'd like me to cover in a different way in a future video. I'm always happy to get the feedback because, of course, I'm not really making these videos for myself. Brush pens are wonderful, and if you haven't given them a try, I would highly recommend that you do. They're not particularly expensive, and the amount of joy that I've received from working with them has been tremendous. If you go back to some of my early podcasts, in fact, maybe the first like 20 or 30 podcast episodes, they're all just brush pen and pen drawings. And I love them. It's such a fun way to work. It's very similar in my head to watercolor, but just a little bit different, a little bit more built for a drawer. Well, as always, thank you for being here. And thanks to my patrons as well, who are on the screen. You want to check out my Patreon and the Discord down below? That would be awesome. The Discord community is a free little community where you can share the artwork that you're working on, get some feedback on things, and just have a group of artists to talk to. It's especially important in today's world if you are out of school, because it's hard to find a group of artists and like-minded individuals to talk to. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.